UX design has to be a little bit more ambitious than whether a button can be read or is big enough for your thumb on a mobile, or the actual usability part of it. And I think it goes a bit beyond that as a role.
Hi, I'm your host, Magali Pellissier, and I'm a product manager. Each week, I show you the other side of a product. I interview the people who contribute to making products a success. They are engineers, writers, marketers, support analysts, UX designers, or even salespeople. Not only will I give them the credit they deserve, but will uncover what makes a good product and product manager from their perspective. Over the next 3 weeks, I'm releasing special episodes in a roundtable format. Think about it like a friendly competition between PMs and their stakeholders. On one hand, a team of 2 stakeholders with the same role, for example, UX designers. On the other hand, a team of 2 product managers, including myself. There are 3 rounds, 1 per week, during which I give a word to start with, and each person shares the first word that comes to their mind when they hear it. And we discuss, debate, share our perspectives. At the end of each episode, we vote, and the person who came up with the best word wins a point for their team. There will be debates, battles, and hopefully alignment between PMs and their stakeholders. Stakeholder management is a key skill for product managers, so just as you are obsessed with listening to your customers, let's hear from your stakeholders. Welcome to this roundtable between product management and UX design. On the UX design team, I am pleased to welcome 2 of my previous guests, Pamela Sanchez and Hayden Chambers. In episode 6, my first UX designer representative in this podcast, Pamela, based in Colombia and working for Torre, talked to me about being a UX designer in a startup after having been a UX researcher for 2 years before that. In addition to being a creative soul, I was impressed by how she is very hands-on on user research and strategic activities, including road mapping. I then discussed with Hayden in the 12th episode about his role as a product designer at EcoOnline. He's worked across a broad range of design disciplines, starting in design and advertising, but also interactive and web design. Through my interview, he's demonstrated a lot of empathy towards product managers, which he gained in various roles, including as a front-end developer and mentor. Those 2 episodes with Pamela and Hayden are amongst the most successful so far in the podcast. So if you've missed them, I recommend giving them a listen. In team product management, I am pleased to welcome for the first time Irina Struck, a product manager at EndsIQ, where she's leading 2 SaaS products that empower companies to keep their high-risk teams safe. Being a true believer in the power of sharing ideas and building communities, Irina organizes monthly Product Tank meetups in London, where professionals working in product come together to discuss the most interesting topics. I will be the second member of the team. I'm the lead product manager at RFI Global, a data and insights company. After a few years in the SaaS space, I took the leap for a challenge to build a startup within an established company and transform waterfall-style services into an agile product. I enjoy thinking holistically about the entire customer experience and creating work environments based on trust and openness, which is why I launched this podcast. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. So Irina joins me in the product management team and Pamela and Hayden in the UX design team. So we're starting this first round today with the first word, which is, and I always like to start about this one because our stakeholders here are UX designers. So I like to start with what they do. What is the first word that comes to mind when you hear UX design? And we're going to let Irina in product start first.
Thanks for the question. So probably go for user advocate. Just because in my experience, user experience designer is always the person who is the representative of the end user in any sort of discussion or meeting room. So I always go to them with the questions like, what would the end user do? What would the end user think? How would they behave and things like that. So I think my first association, would be user advocate.
Right. Hayden, I saw you nodding and thinking. So do you agree with that? What's the word that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, it's a funny one. I think it's great. I think it's a great word. But my own take was care. And I come to that one in a very similar vein. Businesses can sometimes be ruthless, and MVPs can be ruthless, and the day-to-day of businesses and products can be really savage. So I like to think that UX is that sort of layer on top, that little bit of care precisely for the user that thinks about what their world is like.
That's a great word. Okay, I love it. Pamela, do you agree with that? What do you think?
I think the word that came to my mind is a combination of what Irina and Hayden have just said. And it's about, I thought, well, my first two words were user-centered and empathy. Because as Hayden mentioned, I think it's very like the center of UX design is being that empathetic and caring for the user and the experience that they're going to receive with the solution that we're building. So I think that centricity that you can have with the user in the research or in the time invested in understanding the problem that they're facing is what makes all of the process of UX design what with the word UX is for the user and the empathy you have with them.
Good. That's great to see we are aligned at least. You're not allowed to cheat and use somebody else's word. Right. My word is usability. So, when we talk about the product trio, the engineering team is seen as responsible for the feasibility from a technical standpoint. The product manager is responsible for the value that it brings for the users and the viability for the company. And the UX design team are responsible for the usability. Hayden, it's so fun to have you on camera because you're always making so many head gestures. So what do you think?
Oh, I don't know. That one feels very boxed for the role, to be honest. UX design has to be a little bit more ambitious than whether a button can be read or is big enough for your thumb on a mobile, or the actual usability part of it. And I think it goes a bit beyond that as a role.
And that's a good point. And Irina, in your experience, are UX designers going beyond usability? Because I think I had two types of UX designers. The one who were really focused on the interface itself and the buttons and the usability. But some people who went far beyond that into being actual user advocates. And they would almost double me as a PM. So have you got experience with any of these two types of UX designers, Irina?
Yeah, it's actually a good question because in my experience, I always worked with product designers and they were usually both UX and UI competent. But I feel like a UX designer would mostly focus on what happens before the UI comes in place, at least in my view. So they would do a lot of research, user interviews, some sort of high-level mock-ups, but not really going into details of what the color button would be and things like that. But yeah, it would be good to hear Pamela's thoughts about that. What's your experience?
And I think that's a very interesting point because with Hayden, the first question I asked you during your interview in this podcast was, what's the difference between a product and a UX designer? And you had the same view as Irina. And before that, I had actually talked to Pamela, and Pamela is a UX designer, but Pamela does everything. She's even involved in the roadmap. So even though her title is actually UX only, that goes far beyond. And I see Pamela tell me if I'm wrong, but in your role, you're a product designer, you're involved in the roadmap, you do all the user research, you're pretty much a product manager number 2.
Yeah, I am indeed. My role can be considered a UX designer and also a UX researcher and also a UI designer. So it's like I'm doing a little bit of everything. And I agree in terms of what Hayden said of the importance of maybe having more abstraction on what a UX designer is than just what the usability and feasibility of the product or the solution is. And I agree also with Irina on the abstraction of what a product designer is as well.
So as a product manager, it makes my life super easy when a UX designer is that type of UX designer who goes beyond just usability. But maybe a question for you, Hayden and Pamela. What do you think it takes a UX designer, in the limited, restricted sense, to be that person who is more going to influence the roadmap and be the actual user advocate that we want him to be?
I think it depends a lot on the company that you're working at and the stage that it is at. So, for example, in my company right now, we're a small startup that kind of small, that's just in a early stage that's starting to just build the teams and creating all of the processes and systems within the teams. So that is why my role is very, I would say, generalist instead of being so specialized in something. But if you see other companies that are way more advanced, type of Google, or, I'm using Google as an example because I just recently read something about them. They have way more types of designers, I would say. They go very specialist on what they're doing. So you can see that there's motion designers, visual designers, interaction designers. So there's just a ton of details that you can get into of what the role of design is. But I think that the main variable there is the size and the stage of the company that you're working with or at. So for me, it's very important that I can do multiple of the tasks of what a PM would do or a UX researcher would do, because that's what's required right now at this stage. But again, that's my perspective on why it varies.
Yeah, it's nice. There's two axes about this. One is the size of the company, as Pamela says, and the other is the design maturity of the company. So you can have a massive company that's really immature in the design process and vice versa. McKinsey do a great questionnaire for companies to unearth how mature they are or aren't, and it comes down to one thing. It's like, how ingrained is the concept of design in the company, even up to like C-level? So how much decision making is design having, or what sort of influences it having, how many people in the company are aware of it, and I think that has a big impact. Taking small groups of people that are focused on a particular role like UX to a broader, more ambitious thing of like, oh, well, how are we going to shape this company? How are we going to move to the next level or outperform our competitors?
So, Irina, where do you think your company is at right now then?
Yeah, so we are a fairly smaller company as well. We are 20 people about. So I think we are on a more of a holistic view of a designer as a whole. So they do pretty much all of the stages, same as Pamela.
What I find is when you try to recruit a UX designer, I don't know if any of you can share this experience. You also see the difference in the type of profile, but lots of UX designers who come from a UI design background. And in that case, maybe that can be that first type of designer who may not be ready to have that holistic view. And then there's people who have more experience. Is it linked to experience, or I'm not sure how we can identify. I think it's a lot of personality and what people like to do as well.
I think it's also a lot about the product way of thinking about something and not only focusing on the little details that need to be done.
Yeah, so your responsibility as a product manager as well to let them express this. Because if you just say, oh, can you just design this and that, and you don't involve them, then they don't have
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I had an experience where there was this girl that joined the company I was working with. She had a background in UI design mainly, but the role that she was joining was for UX designer. And her main challenge was the practices that she had during her design process. So for her, it was very weird to invest time in research or in talking to the user, in understanding those problems. She had a lot of challenges at the beginning in creating problem statements and all of those things that are required for making good UX. And the way that worked for her to solve that problem was just practicing. So we just started giving her projects. She was very guided by her product manager at the time, and he had all the tools to help her out in what the process and what the practices and tools that she needed to become a UX designer with her UI background. So she came with a mindset of genius design and just making things because she thought they looked good. So this was just maybe something of practice for her to catch up on that and become the UX designer that she wanted to be.
In terms of the two types of people, I'm seeing a lot lately of people who might have gone through very specific UX courses or boot camps. So they are versed in that. At least the curriculums I'm seeing a lot lately have very sort of clearly defined processes. They tick the boxes of user journeys. They tick the boxes of double diamond design thinking, and maybe to their detriment on the other end of it, which is, well, can you come up with something which is going to actually rock the user's world in the end? But in terms of getting from there, from a specific like local sort of job focused role up to maybe a more senior kind of input from like pushing into the business side of things, just as senior product managers will do, and senior engineers as well. I think that just takes being in the trenches and learning the hard way, being in startups that fall over, or being in companies that scale massively, and hopefully, latching on to people who have done it, or getting into mentoring sort of situations. It's also...
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And I think you're right about that, because product roles in general, and that includes UX design right now, so trendy right now. There's so many training courses online, and a lot of them teach you those methodologies. And you can know them, like you've seen the training, but you really need to learn how to implement it and in practice. And that's also what I love about this podcast, is the honesty from people. So saying, there's the theory and there's a practice, and we failed and we tried this and it didn't work. And it's not always follow the methodology by the book. You need to adapt it to whatever you're doing. So I want to go back to your point, Hayden, care. So can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because we've talked about, I think our three answers were a bit similar, around user centricity and all of this, but care is a bit different.
The care, I meant it in the sense that Pamela suggested with empathy. It's that looking after, because you are the advocate. So I don't think it's too far off the other answers there. I think there's probably a little bit of, holding the shield up when business decisions will get in the way, and, protecting the user. So from that sense, the care, and also perhaps having a vision for the product that is a bit longer term, perhaps, than maybe just, look, we've got this sprint, we've got 5 weeks to develop, we've got this roadmap, It's kind of thinking about the longer journey and going, this user is going to be with us for 3 years. They're going to have certain expectations of the evolution of the product. We're going to delight them in these ways, hopefully at times. So that kind of sense of the word care.
There's two things I take from that. There is care for the users, because you say, we don't want to disrupt them too much. And I think sometimes the decisions we make around UX designs, and that's one of the topics we touched on with you, Hayden, around the definition of MVP, are quite short term. So how do we make sure that whatever we put in the product and whatever design we agree is a bit more forward-looking, and we think, okay, well, if we make that decision now, it might come and bite us later on?
The short of it for me is that you have to defend your corner. PMs have to defend the roadmap and the organisation and getting stuff out the door, because if they didn't, then nothing would ever get out the door. And techs have to defend their side of things, because if they don't, we're going to end up with a pile of legacy code that just isn't working. And it's the same with UX. Everyone has to defend their corner.
And I agree, and I love the term that Hayden used of being that defender of the user in multiple choices that are made in all of the process of building a product and getting something out for the people to buy. Because you, as a UX designer, you are the voice of that user. You're the one that's talking to them. You're the one that's understanding them, and you're the one that's facing the company when making decisions. It is a lot on your hands of how can you be that defender of the user. And not, because that in the end, if you are able to achieve that communication of what the user really needed and why, then you're gonna have the best outcome. Otherwise, as Hayden mentioned, again, just referencing you a lot, it's gonna be just a product that no one's gonna want to use, no one's gonna want to buy, and it's gonna be also your responsibility because you didn't speak out for them.
Hence, I'm trying to promote my word here. Hence, usability.
And user advocacy.
Okay, so Irina, do you think when you, as a product manager, make decisions about designs, because at the end of the day, even if designers come up with the designs, you're the one, who has to say, well, this is what we're going to do or not. So do you think you are thinking long-term as well, or sometimes do we cut corners for MVPs?
I'm usually quite guilty at cutting corners because I like to, ruthlessly prioritize. At least I'm trying to, and put up multiple iterations and things like that. And I feel like my favorite thing is to say, hey, let's include this in version 1, in version 2, or version 3 or something like that. And I know people probably hate it. So yeah, not always great at it, to be honest.
And now I'm going to promote Hayden's word care, because there's also care for UX designers themselves. And what we were discussing last time is also the fact that we cut corners as product managers is not always nice for the UX designers because that's their work and they've put a lot of effort and they obviously know what's best for the users, but sometimes it can be a bit demotivating, I guess, for some UX designers when you start removing all the things that make the user experience delightful for users.
I just want to add one point there is that those Moscows that we're all in love with, and I say that sarcastically, sometimes it's really hard to know, like if you're going to use a metaphor, if you're building a bridge over a ravine, sometimes it's hard to know whether you're cutting something which is going to get the bridge to the other side or you're just making it narrower. And UX designers will say, oh, you're chopping it off. You're only getting halfway. You're going to have lemmings falling off this bridge. But sometimes the reality of it's just a narrow bridge and it gets there and we can make it wider as we go on. So that's a real challenge. I think from my perspective, it's hard knowing what that defining limit is.
And that is brilliant because the next words in this roundtable are related to how we measure success and how much time we can dedicate to trying to find out what is the best design. So that will be perfect. So for this one, to close this round, we have Irina said user advocate, Hayden said care, Pamela said empathy, user-centric, and I said usability. Pamela, which one do you vote for?
I think my favorite is, and not because he's on my team, but Hayden's. But honestly, because I think it's abstract enough to wrap up most of the points of what makes UX design, what UX design is. And is that care for the business, care for the user, care for the process, care for the research, care for the problem, care for the solution. And it involves what the word is perfectly.
Hayden, do you vote for yourself?
Actually, no. I like Pamela's word because empathy generally is sorely lacking, both culturally and specifically business-wise. It tends to be lacking. So if there was one shining element that I had to pluck out of that thing, empathy is a great way of understanding what that is, the connection to your user. So I would choose that one.
I was just going to say that I agree with Hayden, and I was also going to say empathy, even though it's not my team, but, there you go.
I was about to ask you, okay, you vote for mine and I vote for yours.
Yeah, what would we do if you had 2 and 2? Who's the winner?
I guess we'll see in the next round, and that's even more tension for the next round. Okay, I will vote for, I like care for all the reasons that Pamela mentioned, and also for the idea of caring for people who work in the company as well. Your users, the problems, the solutions, and all of this, but also caring for UX designers themselves. Okay, so I think it's a strong win for the UX design team. Well done. Cool. I wish this was a video recording because you could see everybody's face. Right, we will come back and fight harder on the PM side for the next round. Thank you very much, everybody, and let's meet in the next round. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it has enabled you to understand your stakeholder and inspired you to better work with them to make successful products. If so, please share the link with your friends and colleagues. And if you want to suggest some topics, some guests, if you have questions you'd like me to ask during the interviews, or if you have any feedback, you can write to me at magalipellissier@hotmail.fr.